Okay, hello and welcome everyone to this CEPR webinar. My name is Antonio Fatás. I'm a professor of economics at INSEAD. I'm a vice president and research fellow at CEPR. I'll be moderating this presentation by Davide Furceri, who is here from the IMF and is going to present some of the insights from a recent chapter in the Fiscal Monitor of October 2025 on spending smarter, how efficient and well allocated public spending can boost economic growth. Now, for all of us who've done some work on fiscal policy or care about fiscal policy, we understand this is a very pressing issue. Many governments are struggling with high debt. We know that in some cases, sort of fiscal plans or budgetary plans will have to be either changed or corrected over the coming years. And the big question is how one can do that from a point of view of sort of economic efficiency and also that is politically sort of feasible. And thinking about reforms that help economic growth obviously will always make those plans sort of easier and more feasible from an implementation point of view. So this is what the chapter is about. Davide will present the insights from the chapter in the next 25 to 30 minutes. That's what we have agreed. Participants will be able to ask questions through the Q&A function, the Q&A button in Zoom. So you will be able to type your questions. You should go ahead and start typing questions as early as you want, but the last sort of section or the last part of the webinar will be the Q&A that I will conduct as a moderator. I'll pick some questions from the Q&A. I might ask some questions myself. So Davide, the floor is yours if you want to share some slides.
Thanks very much, Antonio, and thanks to all that are here today, either from Europe, US, or other parts of the world. So today I'm going to present some of the key message, key highlight of the Fiscal Monitor that was released early in October in Washington, D.C. This year, Fiscal Monitor focus on one issue, which is we believe is quite important, is how countries can boost growth by spending smarter. And here, spending smarter, we mean basically two things. One is improving the composition of spending in a way that is budget neutral, in a way that doesn't necessarily lead to either consolidation or more fiscal expansions. And the second, how to improve not only the composition, but also the efficiency of public spending. So the way that, let's say, a public investment translates to the increase in the stock of capital. Why the motivation of this chapter? We heard from many countries, many authorities, colleagues, that fiscal situations, we know that is quite challenging. What we see in many countries is debt levels are very high. We see that interest payment rising. And if you look at the medium-term forecast that we published this year, we see that actually public debt is projected to further rise. This in a context where spending needs in some countries are becoming more and more salient. Think about, for example, the defense spending in Europe. And in a context where growth is not helping to put debt in a downward trajectory, what we see in many countries, there's been a marked downgrade, and actually a market decline in labor productivity growth. And again, this is not an issue of some specific group of countries, it's an issue that is broad-based. So in this chapter, basically, we try to see whether countries can do something about this issue. And why spending can be allocated to many things. We do believe that now perhaps is the time to reallocate public spending in a way that tends to boost growth. This is important not only for picking up growth itself, fostering an environment to more favorable reforms, as Antonio just mentioned, but also put that on a downward trajectory. Indeed, there are several studies that shows that gross spend are probably among the most important factors that have led countries to reduce debt. So how is possible to do in a way that is political feasible, or at least much more political feasible than just doing austerity? In this chapter, we highlight two ways that this can be done. One is by improving allocative efficiency of spending, in a way deciding on which project probably spending can be directed more. And second, how to improve technical efficiency of spending, so in a way that we make sure that each dollar that is spent, it really contributes to think about the production function of the economies. What I'm going to show you today in the presentation is structured around three main research questions that this chapter try to tackle. And we do this in a variety of forms, including building new databases, etc. The first issue that we try to look is where we are now, in the sense, how is right now growth is really pro-spending, what are the constraints to improve the spending allocations, how much spending in some sense is wasted, which are the countries where spending efficiency there is more scope to improve, what are the area where spending efficiency can improve the most. The second question that we tackle in the chapter is how countries can do reform that can improve both the composition of spending as well as close some of this efficiency gap. And finally, the ultimate question, which brings back to the motivation of the chapter, is whether these reforms are likely to generate significant output gain, significant growth effect, at least transitory effect. Okay. Let me give you a quick snapshot of the key finding on the chapter, which I will go in detail a bit later. The first is that, going to the first question, is that there is significant scope for countries to spend in more pro-growth area. I'm going to use some charts that actually shows that the way that the countries are spent actually has been less away towards pro-growth area, more to other items. And second, and perhaps more important, there is a significant scope for countries to improve efficiency. Around the world, efficiency gap are around 30%. In other words, there is a scope to at least get 30% more value for money than what countries are currently getting. The second, I think, important finding of the chapter is that, yes, it's not easy to do some of these reforms that help countries to spend these matters, but there are plenty of cases where countries indeed manage. And typically, these cases that we've seen are centered around a few elements. One is improving institutional frameworks, both in terms of governance, both in terms of control of corruptions, in terms of public investment management. Second, another area what we find is that there are procedures, and like, for example, spending review, technical procedures that can help. There are areas where reform in some components of spending, such as health, pensions, and wages, they can create scope for more pro-growth spending. And finally, there are ways to improve the delivery of spending. And this is like, for example, digitalization is an area, another area is partnering with the private sectors. Most important, the chapter shows that by spending smarter, countries can deliver significant gains. Typically, in absolute terms, these gains are larger in emerging market low-income countries because, as I'll show you later, is where more efficiency gap are larger, but also where let's say stock of capital, for example, is lower, but are also quite significant for many advanced economies today. And we see that both elements, so both improving allocative efficiency as well as improving technical efficiency, can generate significant output gains. And these two elements really go hand in hand. Okay, let's go with the first question: how public spending look like around the world. And for this, we put together a very impressive database of spending categories, goes back in the 60s. The dataset it will be publicly available, so this can be used for many researchers for many potential research applications. If you go back to the level of spending per se, what you see in these charts on the left is that government spending is becoming even larger over time. Despite sometimes we may think that the government is cutting more, there are like been around the world austerity programs, etc. One striking fact is that spending has increased over time. Is typically larger in advanced economies, which in some sense is consistent with the typical laws that regulate public spending with the level of demand, the sense of the countries. But it's been increasing also in emerging market and is quite tight, low-income countries. Especially low-income country, we discussed in the Fiscal Monitor, this level of spending, especially high in a context of very much limited revenue. However, despite the fact that countries have typically spent more in terms of the overall GDP, what you see is that they have not necessarily spent more on items that are likely to promote growth. The first is a public investment. You see that public investment around the world has declined by 2 percentage points of GDP, and this declining trend has been broad-based. If you compare the periods that goes 2000 until the last decades, you see this decline, but actually this is in some countries this is a decline that is even started early, like in the mid-90s in the case of some advanced economies. The second element, and this is in the charts, if you look more at the functional composition of spending, not like at the budget classification, but more at the functional classification. So you classify spending on defense, on education, on R&D, on human capital, and so on. You see that spending on components that are likely to be associated with higher growth, so education, R&D, and human capital, they do not account much for the budget. Specifically, they account around 30%, one-third overall spending is spent in items that are likely to generate more growth. Our largest component in many countries is a general public service. Another component is basically social protections and old age, pension, and so on. This are some of the largest categories that we have today and that are likely actually to increase further in the days to come. Another important element of what we've seen about the level of spending is that the spending has become more rigid over time. Here on the left, we look at some element of spending rigidity. It's based on a simple autocorrelation process regarding spending. We put together a data set. Again, this data set is available for research purposes soon to more wider community. What you see is that spending rigidity is relatively high in the sense that this typically correlation is about 0.3, means that one-third of spending is typically locked from one year to another. Now, while some spending rigidity is not necessarily bad, think about you have rigid spending because you have a multi-year spending framework, multi-year spending framework on public investment. So this, of course, will tend to boost the spending rigidity. In many countries, what we see is that a large component of the spending rigidity is due to spending that is mandated. Pension is one component. Another important component are public wage bill. And while it's not necessarily the case that public wage bill are bad for growth. For example, like if you think about education, a large component of public wage bills basically define overall educational spending is about 65%, more than 65%. Sometimes what you see in some countries that very high public wage bill reflect wage premium between the public and the private sector. So in some countries, even for similar tasks, for similar jobs, and similar skill set, you see difference between public wage and private, with the public being larger. So one element of this spending rigidity is that sometimes is the results of some, let's say, market failure or some constraints. And another is that makes difficult sometimes for countries to reallocate spending when, for example, they want to do, let's say, a budget neutral fiscal stimulus will reduce the probability of countries to do such a type of operations. So point number one, spending has not been necessarily allocated to pro-growth items, partly reflecting some rigidity and some mandated spending. And then the key question is how efficient is the spending? And here we did really a measured work where we construct a new measure of spending efficiency for more than 170 countries since 1980s. Importantly, this spending efficiency are time varying. They control for specific country characteristics and allow for multi sort of output. Now, what are these typically spending efficiency in the literature for those that are not familiar with? Basically, are measures that try to combine input to production, in this case is spending, let's say, on public investment or other components with output, such as infrastructure on road, transportation, and so on. One important improvement of the database that we put together is that we don't only look at the physical infrastructure, but also the quality. Think about advanced economies, it's not sometimes the issue of whether countries have a road or not, but it's more like about the quality of the infrastructure, and we use also survey data to construct these measures. An important element is that we combine all these elements and we try to reduce measurement error as well as issue related to just using specific output or input by using a model averaging technique. So we have like a huge amount of models, huge large efficiency for each given countries, and then we aggregate these scores. What comes from this exercise is very interesting, is very relevant. There are two main takeaways. We could study this measure of spending efficiency for the four components of spending that we are typically interested in terms of pro-growth, so investment, health, education, and research and development. And the two takeaways are first, as probably someone would have expected, ex-ante, and has been documented in the literature, you see that the low-income countries have larger efficiency gap, where the efficiency gap is defined as the difference between the country-specific measure of efficiency and the efficiency score of the top frontier. So low-income countries are typically characterized by larger efficiency gap. And if you look at the categories, you see where this gap are largest. One is investment, and second is research and development. The second element, which is important, and it exploits really the uniqueness of our data set, is that this efficiency score have changed over time. You would expect that, just because of technology or just because of significant improvement, for example, on life expectancy and so on, you would expect that some of this gap are narrow. And this is what you see in this second chart. You see, again, for advanced economies, emerging market, low-income countries, a narrowing of this gap, a sort of actually efficiency gap convergence, where typically, if you think about today, there are not huge difference in the efficiency gap across economies. There are, on average, for the, let's say, median country, median advanced, median emerging, median countries, there are still substantial difference. Just to give you a number, the median low-income country has an efficiency gap of 35, emerging market around 30, advanced economies are lower. But there is some heterogeneity within this group. So it's not always the case that if you're an emerging market, you have efficiency gap that are larger than advanced economies or vice versa. Okay, so there has been significant improvement. Indeed, there has been, in the chapter we document specific cases where countries have managed to, through reforms, to get down in terms of efficiency gap and improving efficiency. So let me summarize the first part of the motivation of the analysis. Spending has not been necessary for growth, and second, there are significant efficiency gap to close. Key questions are what we can learn from this narrowing, for example, of efficiency gap, what we can learn from what countries have done. In the chapter, we show both through some empirical analysis, but also through a list of detailed country cases where we go deep, we understand exactly the process of reform that led to this improvement, what countries can typically manage to improve efficiency and improve the composition of spending. One key takeaway that we see in the chapters, here we show a simple correlation. In the chapter, we check whether this correlation is more robust. We do Bayes and model average technique and other technique to check the robustness of this correlation, is that institutions matters a lot. Institutions matter a lot in terms of, for example, governance effectiveness, control of corruption, and specifically fiscal institutions that tend to improve the effectiveness through the way public, for example, the public investment are managed. So the IMF has, for a long time, constructed the measures of public investment management effectiveness score. And what we see is that the countries that are typically characterized by higher efficiency score are also countries that tends to have better performance. And most of these things are, again, correlation are robust, not only for various control variables, of course, but most important for variables that relate to the level of development. Indeed, in the second charts, these scores are typically done through technical assistance. After following technical assistance, and we typically tend to have more technical assistance for emerging market and low-income countries than advanced economies. So in the second chart, actually, you see that this is pattern really is a pattern within a country group, so more within developing economies. Another element that what we think is that has been important, and perhaps this is even more important, at least it seems to be evidence how strong and important it was, is the spending review. Many countries have done learning to spending review. For example, in the chapter, we look at one specific case, which is Slovakia, that has done since 2017 several spending review that have led to basically reduce the total amount of expenditure by about 7%. And what we see here, we collect data from the OECD about several spending reviews that taking place in many countries. We do standard Jordan local projections. And what you see is two important elements. The first is that this spending review tends to often change the composition of spending, but also to increase the efficiency. And in detail, why this is the case is because these are typically reviews that tend to align both the spending, the amount of spending with the objective of the government. Sometimes often more the objective of the government is not necessarily, let's say, to increase public wage, but it's more to increase growth. So we see that in some countries following spending review, the reallocation of spending has moved forward towards more pro-growth items and less away from, let's say, public wage bill. And the second, so they also allow to check existing consistent of how money are spent. There is for example, in some countries, the spending review is a cross-check of following each region should follow the best performance region in terms of how public money are spent. And I mean, Italy in the past there's been indeed, for example, spending review around these lines. And what you see is that this spending review are associated with a significant increase in spending efficiency, which are relatively large given the Oslo moving art is variable. So it's possible to do reforms that tends to move away from, let's say, not pro-growth spending, but also to improve efficiency. Now, let me focus to the last part of the presentation on the first question. So, okay, there is a significant scope. I'll tell you that countries are managed. There are tools that countries can use to spend smarter. The question is how much output gains countries can be achieved. And in the chapter, we do few exercises. We do two main exercises. One is an empirical one base, is a local projection framework with synthetic control and other types of analysis that typically done. And the second is model simulations, because what you're interested is not only about the short to medium term gains. It's something that you can do with data, given you have 35 years, 40 years of data, cannot really go to long-term effect, let's say 30 years long output effect. But also we use a model simulation to understand better the channels through which this element, spending smarter and efficiency, can affect long-term output, but also to really go to a very long-term output effect. Now, the empirical framework is very similar to what also Antonio and others have looked when we look at the effect of fiscal policies on long-term output. Antonio has a very nice paper on hysteris effect, etc., etc. Here we do like one main twist. It's very, for many countries we are interested, it's very hard to identify exogenous variation in defense spending. Therefore, we are actually working on a narrative database for all countries in the world, but this has not been ready yet. So we try to minimize endogeneity by doing two things. The first is we look at the main change in the composition of spending given a fixed envelope. What you see in the data is that most of this change in spending are not really done for necessary to improve short, medium-term growth. Often there are also austerity plan or are done as a big initiative, some big reform that the countries has put in place. And then once you have these episodes, you can do exercise like augmented inverse probability weighting scheme, where you weight more observations that are more predictable based on a large set of covariates. So we try to address the issue. Of course, we do also synthetic control, etc., etc. And the episode basically are defined as a big jump in the one component of spending, giving spending envelope. Here is a definition in the slides, but in the chapter we are made. And then we apply this data to firm and sectoral data to try to understand, for example, the impact on output to the FP, so whether it's a true reallocation or is within firms' productivity. We use sectoral data also to do some sort of diff and diff. We interact sectoral firms' characteristics with these big shocks and try to address some of the endogeneity issues. What are the key takeaway of this analysis? That this effect, especially public investment, are quite sizable. Also, education, typically you don't see much in the short term. It's really health because it really takes a very long-term effect for the effect of health spending to materialize. And reassuringly, when you try to scale this effect from the big shock that you see in terms of implicit multiplier, you see multipliers that are sort of familiar in the literature of, for advanced economies, at least for emerging market. We see that this is spending, especially public investment, it affects more also in the short term, but also it affects not only output in various horizons, but one key channel is through TFP, at least for the long-term effect. And we see that this effect is quite sizable for all countries, but there is some sort of sectoral heterogeneity. It matters more typically for countries that are open to trade or where there is more flexibility in production functions that are better to reallocate this new change in spending. Importantly, what we do in the chapter is we check how these results that we see in terms of output can be shaped by the level of efficiency. So whether the fact that you have a low versus a high efficiency score make a difference in the output effect. And this is what you find. You find that when this big investment, either in physical capital or major push on health, education, and R&D have taken place in countries or in periods of times where efficiency has been very high. You see that these output gains have been very large. In contrast, other reallocation of spendings that were done with very low efficiency score actually didn't produce any output effect. In some cases, were also negative in the sense that you were redirecting spending on something that was really wasted, while you could have used for components that have other efficiency. And this really makes the point that yes, spending, deciding, and then the idea of what you spend makes sense, but also improving the way that you spend is crucial if you really want to reap out the benefit. And finally, we use a theoretical model to try to understand the channels and to go to the long-term effect. The model basically is a sort of DAG framework with a balanced growth path. We have public investment that enter the production function financing public capital. We have the public capital investment in improve human capital accumulation. We have a role for R&D, and then we have the standard law motion. What you see is that if you calibrate this DAG to a typical advanced economies and to a typical emerging market economy, you see that when you reallocate spending, let's say, from government consumption to either infrastructure investment, human capital R&D, you get very large output effect. In the case, if you're advanced economies, this output effect can go about to 3%. If you're emerging market, just because you are starting from a lower level of capital, so the rate of return for this type of investment is higher, you see actually that you can get almost 4 or 6% in output gain, especially when you invest in human capital, but either boosting education or health. So this is a sizable output effect, especially in a situation where we are now. And what we show in the chapter is that this output effect you see now, they can be almost double when if countries close the gaps with the efficiency frontier. This is what you see in the chart, in the left-hand charts. This is the future gain that you can get for advanced economies. For example, in the case of infrastructure investment, you can add to an additional 1.5% in terms of output. If you're emerging market economies, this effect tends to be really larger. And this effect tends to be larger the farther you are from the efficiency frontier, and the faster you try to complementary this gain. So especially for emerging market reforms that are impactful and then that they are large in terms of at least the pace of the reform can deliver huge output gain through efficiency. And finally, in the chapter, we look also at complementarities of spending, like, for example, how whether instead to reallocate everything, let's say, to public investment, what happens if countries reallocate, let's say, 1% of GDP, some to public investment in human capital, some in terms of R&D. And we see that there are often complementarities. In the case of the advanced economies, it makes actually more sense in terms of output gain to complement R&D spending with human capital. So getting half typically get larger output gain because there is complementarity between investing in R&D, and you need people that have a skill that are able to use this new technology. Or actually foster private sector diffusion again in the case of advanced economies. In the case of emerging market, there are sort of gains between short to medium term if you try to balance, let's say, short-term objective, try to foster more public investment in the short term and human capital in the medium term. So what countries can do, again, I think these are reforms that are needed. They can produce a sizable gain. And the way to go in the chapter, again, through case studies and through analysis, is basically point number one: improve your framework, strengthen institution and public investment management. Second, thinks about more strategic approach spending to identify area of saving through spending review or through reforms in other area. And finally, improve the delivery of public spending through digitalization and the private sectors. So I stop here. It's about 30 minutes, so we have quite a bit of time for the Q&A. So thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Davide, for that clear explanation of the chapter. If you can stop maybe sharing your slides, so that's perfect. Again, as I said earlier, for participants, if anyone wants to ask questions, the Q&A is open. Just type your questions and I'll keep an eye on that. But I'll start with a couple of questions. Again, maybe they're a little bit broad and outside of what you present, but it's sort of one of my first reactions when I read a chapter on reform and sort of getting things right when it comes to fiscal policy. When you think about governments as they look at your chapter, what is it that stops governments from adopting some of these reforms? Is it a matter of knowledge? Meaning there is a lack of understanding of what is efficient, what is not efficient. There is a lack of understanding what drives growth versus what doesn't. Or the knowledge is there, but again, there are the usual political dynamics or political issues that stop them from cutting certain things and replacing them with something which is either more efficient or more sort of favorable to growth. Sorry, unmute yourself. Yeah.
I think it's a combination of both elements. I think there is this issue of political economy. So we see that sometimes countries, the way that the spending is locked or spending is decided is sometimes for political reasons. There are a lot of paper in the literature, for example, that when many European countries has to meet the Maastricht criteria, if you see like the component that was easier cut was public investment. Why this was the case? Because of, typically voters are able to monitor and see some component of spending. Again, think about public wages, while other components are less visible. And again, think of public investment. I think like what we try to make in the chapter and advance on this political economic aspect is that there are certain improvement institutions which are not difficult to make. And again, there are still countries that they are improving fiscal institutions, even as advanced economies. Things about countries that do improve medium-term framework in the way that they monitor spending, or countries where they can do spending review. There is more and more actually demands for countries to do spending review. So in some countries where some of these concerns are more visible, there are ways to generate improvement in the composition of spending. And importantly, what we try to show in the chapter is that this reform can generate large output gain, but that are not only for the longer term, but also for the short term. And I think like this is very important when you think of political cycle, political gains on this reform. So we are not saying countries you should do austerities. Of course, if you do austerities, spend, output is going to decline. We are recommending things that ultimately are likely to improve economic activity, also in the short term. And then I think equal, this should be a good thing for politicians in the way that they think about the reform. And then there are, I think, like a lesson from the chapter that, especially for many emerging markets, sometimes strengthening institutions, improving governance. Sometimes some of these reforms, yes, are difficult, but also because maybe they are not sequenced well or not accompanied well. It's not for this chapter, but actually we had like a previous chapter in April where we discuss a framework on how countries can improve political acceptability of many reform. And there we show that strategic engagement with the stakeholder is key. Also strategic communication. For example, like in the chapter now it says, well, if you want to reduce some spending and generate additional spending for public investment, probably in many countries this means improving the pension system. How countries can improve pension system? In the chapter, for example, we find like two elements. One is that some of the way that you can improve the stability of the pension system and actually reduce pension spending at the aggregate level is not necessary by changing the age requirement, but changing some of the either eligibility criteria or some of the prioritization of the contribution, and these reforms are typically more palatable. And the second is the way that you change the pension reform. For example, there are some specific countries, I think in our chapter we mentioned like Uruguay, where the countries managed to do a significant reduction in pension spending reform, but through strategic communication, engaging with the stakeholder, and the way that the reform was sold as a way to keep the same level of benefit. So, well, we are going to increase, let's say, by 1 year, let's say, retirement age, but this reform that we are going to make sure that when you retire, you will get the same replacement rate. So there are, I think, things that work, but I fully agree with you that as economists, we have to do more and more to try to understand how our policy recommendation can be actually put in place. I think this is an area where the IMF and my department is working a lot on this.
Let me ask a follow-up question, which is partly motivated by a question in the Q&A. Again, you talk a lot about sort of rebalancing spending from certain components to others, but clearly something has to be reduced. Again, unless you handle everything through increases in efficiency, something else have to be reduced. And implicitly, you're favoring growth, but you're cutting some spending that serves a certain goal. I know you don't go a lot into the chapter, except if you think about efficiency. Again, is there any guide about that? Is there any way to think about those trade-offs with the data that you have?
So I think there are two. So I think in the chapter we make a point about 3 areas where there is the scope to improve or rationalize spending. One, again, I just mentioned, is pension spending. In many advanced economies, pension accounts for 8% of GDP, I believe, and is projected to rise by 2 or 3%. So improving the sustainability of pension system in many countries, in many advanced economies, is important. In the case of emerging market, one big issue is energy subsidies. In many emerging market countries, the amount of money that are spent for subsidies are even larger for the amount of money that are spent for social expenditure. So we are not even thinking about public investment, we're just thinking about social expenditure. So improving the targeting of energy sustain, improving doing energy subsidy reform, this is an area where there can be important benefit to find leeway for additional spend. Going back to the second part of your question and what we see in the data is that the good things is that if you at least we see empirically that when you do like this, at least countries that done this big shock in terms of changing composition towards more pro-growth, we have not seen a decline in inequality. If any, sorry, we have not seen an increase in inequality. If any, either inequality has been flat, I mean, talking about big spending improvement in education or in health or investment, or actually inequality has declined. Why this is the case? I mean, not in the short term, but in the medium long term, because basically you tend to improve more the equality of opportunity, and this tends to sometimes improve also the quality of outcome. So this is what actually we see in the data. So the two objectives are compatible.
Now, let me ask a question about that rebalancing of spending. And in fact, one of the results in your paper or in your chapter that surprised me a little bit, the results of spending on human capital, the effects are quite strong, in fact, stronger than in other categories. So I was surprised, in particular for advanced economies, that there's such a high return for investment in human capital. I would expect that in emerging markets, but less so in advanced economies. Is there any intuition from your analysis of why that would be the case, even for advanced economies?
These things are basically calibrated to the actual data. My sense is that there is a lot of heterogeneity if you think about, so we're taking the median advanced economies, but it's true that there are some advanced economies where still, if you think about even closing efficiency gap, the gains are small, but there are other countries where even if you think about outcome like PISA score, there are some emerging market countries that they do, like Vietnam, that do much better than many advanced economies. So, I would say there is a huge variability. And when you put emerging market, let's say this variability is more skewed to countries with low efficiency, while in advanced economies is more towards this. Yeah, this is what I would say.
Okay. Now let me ask about another category of spending, which is coming in some of the Q&A questions, which is defense spending. I know you're not in particular analyzing this in your chapter, but clearly this is in the mind of many people and many policymakers today. Is there any way to fit that particular component into the story of this chapter, or is it just very hard to map it into some of these categories?
So I think to the extent that we think about defense as a public investment, so you think defense is either to build a new stock of capital that can be productive, or we think a component of public defense in terms of new research and development, we will tend to translate that this reshuffle is likely to generate positive effect. We are doing actually some work in our division, our department. So in the coming months, a new paper will come up where we look at how large is the impact of defense spending, what will be the spillover, which component is more promising. But in terms of, I think what the chapter can speak is, if you think about public investment and defense is a component of public investment, or a large component of R&D, in theory can generate significant output gains. Then, of course, it really depends a lot on the import content of many countries, whether they're using intermediate input for higher defense spending, let's say locally or from abroad. And we know more broadly that fiscal multipliers are typically smaller when import content is higher, so there is more leakages through the system. So I think in many countries where defense spending has been talked about, I think there is much more lesson to learn from the analysis that so far that has been shown here, or other works by Paolo Surico and others that have shown, for example, for the US, etc.
Yeah. Now, following on the issue of growth, I mean, your paper is not about sort of reforms in general that are pro-growth. Your paper is very much about sort of what type of spending favors growth. But in some cases, you can imagine interactions between the two and sort of doing a reshuffle of the budget at the same time that certain reforms are being done can help from a political point of view sort of sell those reforms. Do you have any thoughts about that, to what extent those reforms can come or not together with some of the spending? I know you include these variables in your analysis, but I don't know whether there's any sort of lessons about interactions between the two.
No, this is great because they gave me an opportunity to talk about some of my previous work with, our still, always fought friends Alberto Lesina, but also with the current colleague Romain Duval and others. In both work, what we see is that there are two important elements. One is that this reform, if you think about in many countries, many advanced economies, there is a scope, for example, to do liberalize product market, to make labor market more efficient. In some emerging market, there is more to scope to accelerate financial reforms. We see that these gains or reforms have important output effect. And this is like, some of the work they've done with many from colleagues. Another area of work that, and this refers to work done with Romain Duval, shows that the effect of some reform, it really depends on on the economic cycle of the reform. For example, think about labor market reforms that tends to deregulate employment protection legislation. What we show in a paper with Romain is that when you do this sort of labor market reform, you have a larger output effect when there's a reform are done in good times and when done in bad times. So why? Because in good times, there is a larger mass of firms that is willing to hire more than fire. So if you deregulate, you get more hiring than firing in good times, and the opposite in bad time. So there are reforms through which the economic effect is very much depending on the economic cycle. So to the extent that some of these change in spending and composition can ameliorate economic activity, they can have a sort of interaction even about the economic effect. And second, going back to the political economists and the work we have done with Alberto and other colleague, Dennis Quinn, Chris Papajoy, and Jonathan Ostri, is that it's very key from a political perception when you do this reform. Typically, when countries do reform in the election year and during bad economic conditions, on average, these reforms are politically costly. You see typical decline in vote shares, and countries lose elections, while if you do this reform far from the election year, but more importantly, when economic conditions are more favorable, actually voters, they see this reform in good way because there is a myopia, so voters tends to make it harder for them to distinguish economic effect from the reform itself, from the economic conditions. So again, to the extent that the results of the chapter shows that this change in spending composition have a favorable effect on the economic activity, complementing this spending reform with other structural reforms can A, magnify the output again of both reform, and second, the political feasibility of this reform.
Okay, that's great. Now, let me talk a little bit about or ask some questions about efficiency. I mean, of course, when we were talking before about sort of cutting certain spending for investment, when you talk about pension reforms, this is always very hard. And I'm speaking from France right now, so talking about pension reform is not easy politically. When you talk about efficiency, I think we can all agree. I think it's very hard to disagree that more efficient is better than less efficient. Yeah. Now, can you help me and help everyone calibrate a little bit some of the numbers you have in your results when you talk about 30% efficiency loss? Again, that seems to be like a large number. Is that similar to other estimates? Is that what sort of governments think about how efficient or inefficient they are?
So the correlation with other estimates is very high. So first of all, what does 30% mean? 30% means that if you compare country A with the best performing country, you see that you have 30% scope to basically to close the score. So and there are countries that in each categories they really have performed well. How large are this number? You see similar number from some categories, smaller numbers for some other components, but I would say there is a sort of a very high consistency idea that there is a significant scope for many countries to close the gap. I do believe that for some categories our numbers are a bit larger, and the main difference is that we tend to use data that are not only related to the quantity of things that have been produced, but also the quality. Again, you can still think that if you are in many advanced economies, roads have been built, energy network have been built, airport have been built, many things, but the quality in some of them has not improved as much as the quantity. Actually, in some countries there is an issue of maintenance, the quality of infrastructure is declining, so there is still scope to close this efficiency gap. And there are ways to do it. I mean, I think like strengthening public investment procedure is very important to identify what are really the best project at the minor level. In many countries, there is, for example, this is especially for advanced economies, that use a lot of procurement. This is a significant scope to have procurement systems that are much more competitive forbidden, they're open to everybody, and this can significantly reduce the cost of spending. So there are technical ways through which countries can close a large part of these gaps.
A couple of questions that I see about these. Somebody's asking which are the best countries. I don't know if there's sort of a list of best countries in this in efficiency. And somebody else was asking about the Next Generation European Union initiative, which is sort of partly an initiative as well to try to improve spending composition and possibly efficiency. And I don't know if you want to comment on either, or whether what are the best countries, or whether things like the Next Generation initiative can help with things like efficiency.
I don't want to talk about the best because then people will say which one are the worst. But in the chapter, there are like few cases for each of them that actually we mentioned. We mentioned countries that, for example, they managed to achieve significant improvement efficiency, and I think these are notable. I think like a country like Bangladesh, country like Rwanda, they managed to significantly improve efficiency, especially in efficiency, human capital, and education. For example, in the case of Rwanda, in the chapter goes in details to the various spending reform on education, as well as digitalization that the country has done to improve spending efficiency. Like, for example, they had, I think it's a nice story to say, they have a one laptop per child program, and they manage basically to get 100% of all primary enrollment rate in a very relatively small time. They managed to have a significant improvement in second enrollment. The part of the computer digitization very help. And other countries that managed to do important reform, for example, in that sector is Brazil with the Bolsa Família program, for which basically if you receive transfer, you have to ensure that your children enroll in education and do. So there are ways that countries have managed to improve efficiency. So I would like to perhaps give you more of this example. On the next view, I cannot say much about whether it has been successful or not. I think there are, the IMF publication that have looked in this and have a sense of how countries have used this. So I will, refer the people to this publication. It's not something that we are looking in the context of this chapter.
Okay. Now let me ask you, we have a few more minutes. Let me ask you a couple of questions, might be slightly more academic, but I thought there were things that were interesting in the chapter. I wanted to ask for clarity. I mean, you say a couple of times that the multipliers, the effect on output of changing spending are similar to what one finds in the literature. But my reading is that you have effects which are significantly larger, which I think is good if you think these are good spending, because a lot of the exercises you do keep spending constant. So you're reducing consumption, you're increasing investment, and you get an effect of whatever, 1.5, and you say the multiplier is 1.5. But that's a lot larger because you're cutting consumption at the same time. Am I misreading that the multipliers are indeed higher than some of the quotes you said?
Well, two things. One, in the empirical analysis, one thing that we do, I mean, some of the charts that I show you are not multipliers. To do multiplier, basically what we do is we use like this episode as an instrument, and then we do like the Ramey-Zubairi instrumental variable one way to get the multiplier. And I think for public investment, let me check, I think we get the multiplier of 0.8 after 5 years or around 1, which makes sense, long-term multiplier for public investment have been found to be a bit on the high side. The model, I will be more, is calibrated to the economies. Some of I think like for public investment, multiplier is a bit around 1, but you are right to the extent that you take out government consumption, the multiplier should be smaller. Here, however, the focus is on the longer term. So you still have to think that in the longer term, probably, the multiplier of consumption is 0. And in the longer term, you see this gain. Actually, in the short term, if you reallocate, you don't see any tangible sometimes component because you have in the theoretical model, because you still have a multiplier which is associated to, let's say, government consumption. So you see long-term multiplier which are large, but not in the short term. And I think like even in the initial slide that I show you, for example, if you do human capital in the short term, the output effect is negative because current
Yeah.
consumption has a larger effect than health in the short term. So in the next 2, 3 years in the model, you see that actually the multipliers, this reallocation is negative. It's only when you start to think about 30 years from now that the current consumption is not necessarily having, let's say, on average, very large output effect, while if you invest on something that helps to build either physical or human capital, you have this large multiplier.
I mean, a related question, which is also slightly more academic. I mean, as you look at this growth model, as you do the calibration, I mean, every time you put an endogenous growth model, you can get effects which are very large, which go beyond level effects. Now,
Yes.
my understanding is you try to avoid making those statements and you sort of look at a certain horizon and you say GDP goes up by X because you don't want to make statements which are too broad. Is that correct?
Yes. And also, to be fair, I mean, in the empirical analysis, we don't find so we find as you say, we find in the empirical analysis most of the effects are permanent level effect, but not permanent growth effect. The data they speak more to exogenous sort of growth model where you give a shock, you have a permanent level effect, then endogenous growth model where you have a permanent growth effect. That's
Yeah.
why I think we wanted to also have a robust empirical analysis to cross-validate some of this finding than just using the model, because what you get is basically what you assume in some sense, no?
Yeah. Okay, let me ask you a last question. We have just
Sure.
a couple of minutes, which is a very broad question. As you look at the future, if we were to do another webinar on this subject in 5, 10 years, do you expect to see a lot of progress? Is there any sense that either because of the urgency of high debt or because of something else, that this is going to become a serious policy lever? Or are we going to be talking about something similar X years from now?
Uh, I think we are going to talk about that and still fiscal policy. I think that if you look at the trajectory so far, at least based on our projections, it's definitely going up. It's not going to decline. So my sense is that I don't know if either you, Antonio, or me will be doing this webinar, but probably there will be still someone doing a webinar that says how we can reduce debt and boost growth. So unless there is a huge potential shock, as some people say, so AI can save us all. Unless AI will save us all in many ways, there will be still talking about the issue of high debt and low growth, I think, for the next few years. And our countries, our policymaker can try to break this vicious circle.
Okay. Well, let's hope that at least we talk with a trend that looks slightly flatter than the one
Yeah.
you showed at the beginning. Let's hope that there is some progress because of publications like this one, which again, I urge everyone to read very carefully because there's a lot more in the paper than what Davide has been able to produce here. So let me just close the webinar. We're going to be on time. So thank you, Davide, for your presentation and your insights. Thank you, everyone, for attending and some of you for volunteering some questions. And again, this is a CPR webinar. We do these things often, so please keep sort of listening or hearing our communications for future seminars in the future that look like this. Thank you, Davide. Thank you,
Thank you, Antonio.
everyone.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everybody.